Okay, I'm going to be here on the end. And I probably need that. And can I have that, please? I need that, okay. And I need this. 14, 13, 13, 14, 15, 16. Sorry? You can hear me talking to myself? Okay. Shall we start? Are you guys ready? I'm going to call you up. I'm going to do the little introduction and then call you up. Okay. It's not on? It is on. Okay. Hi, everyone. Can the people, no? Okay, here it's not working. Everyone press the white button on your headphones. White button. Okay. Good. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tracy Wyman. I'm the Chief Impact Officer of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And I would like to welcome you here to our panel today, which is called Upgrading the Architecture of Corporate Climate Standards. I'm sorry to tell you that the chair of our board, Francesco Sarate, is not here to provide opening remarks because he missed his plane. But I will do my best to stand in for him. He'll be here tomorrow, so anyone who has a meeting planned with him, that's going ahead as usual. So let me just start with, I want to thank everyone who's here, and really especially the people who are dialing in, because I know that it's not the same not being in person at COP. A lot of people didn't get badges and wanted to be here but couldn't, so we're very excited to be live streaming this event and to have people all over the world dialing in. Thank you for being here, and thanks especially to WWF, our partner and host, who are offering us this lovely space today. I want to also thank the representatives of our panel who are representing ISO and BSI, GRI, SBTI, my colleague, and I'll introduce everyone individually. And dialing in, we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So you are all aware that today's event and this COP comes at a critical point. We are not moving quickly enough. We need to move much faster. But of course, we do not admit defeat. No, we dig our heels in, we point ourselves forward, and we work even harder, and we work harder together. So what we know is that the change that the world requires can't be done or achieved in an ad hoc manner, right? We need structured frameworks so that everyone can move in the same direction and know where they're going. This is what standard setters provide, right? A structured framework. And the role of standard setters who are here today becomes ever more critical as the need for rapid decarbonization accelerates. We know that we have to collaborate, right? We can't, any individual organization, any country can't achieve large-scale decarbonization alone, and likewise, no standard setter can achieve their aims alone. Collaboration is deep in the DNA of the SBTI. We were established, as most of you know, as an initiative of our founding partners. That was a collaboration which my colleague Alberto Carrillo was a part of right from the beginning, and some of our colleagues here today, between CDP, the UN Global Compact, WWF, WRI, and the Women Business Coalition. And even now, with SBTI spinning off as an independent organization, we work very closely with those founding partners and intend to continue to do so. Um, I want to thank all of the organizations and individuals who have contributed to developing our standards and the standards of our associates here today. Standard setting is a collaborative venture, right? Standard setters don't go into a room and write things up on their own. They go out into the market, they gather input, they gather feedback, they pilot with companies, they test, and that collaboration is at the heart of what we do every day and the heart of what all of the organizations that are here to talk to today do. I want to take this opportunity before we get into the panel to thank and congratulate the almost 10,000 companies that have either set science-based targets or committed to setting their targets, companies and financial institutions. These are really the leaders that the world needs. And if you're here representing a company and don't yet have your science-based targets, then there's no time like the present. We can be here after the event to answer any questions that you have. And for those companies yet to join, we look forward to having you be part of the initiative. You can be part of the solution. It's important that everyone gets on board and embraces the future of rapid decarbonization. Okay, so that's the welcome. I'm really glad to see you all here. We are here today to talk about 4 climate standards, where they are, where they're going, how they fit together. So we know that corporate standards exist to provide a structured framework, I mentioned that, something that is credible, that companies and financial institutions can align with, and use to measure, manage, report on, and actually reduce their emissions. And so what do standard setters have to do? We have to put standards out in the world that prioritize accuracy, transparency, accountability, and alignment with scientific and societal norms. And that is what all of us work every day to do. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at GRI, at GHG Protocol, at ISO, and finally at SBTi. The next 2 years are very important in our ecosystem, because this whole system of standards is in the beginning, middle, and nearing the end of a big overhaul, right? Some parts of our system, like GHGP, have been around for forever, ISO, forever. Others are a little bit newer, but these next 2 years, every one of these standards is going to be updating itself, adjusting. And so everyone is asking us all the time, well, how does this work? How does it all fit together? How do these things relate to each other? Are they aligned? And that's what we're here to talk about today. I hope over the course of the next few minutes, you guys will be thinking about your questions. So if the panel itself doesn't answer your questions, you can put them, we're going to have an online system so that you can submit your questions, and I'll have access to those. I'd like to now invite my panelists to come up. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And where's my clicker? Here it is. So my panelists, please come up. Oh, that's me. So, what's that? Here's the microphone. Let's start with Emily. Emily from ISO, could you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Thank you. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone, or morning and evening to those online, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Emily Faint. I'm the Senior Policy Manager for Net Zero at the British Standards Institution, or BSI, which, relevant to the point that you've made, Tracy, is actually the UK member body of the ISO system. If I'm successful in my session today, hopefully I will have helped demystify this system to you and make you realize that it is your system to use and leverage as well. ISO is what I will refer to in this panel as sort of the formal international standard system. It is a federation of government-appointed or government-recognized national standards bodies that exist in almost every country in the world. We have over 170 members, and I'm here today as part of the UK member, BSI.
Okay, let's go over to Margherita.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I'm Margherita Barbieri. I work at GRI and I lead the revision of the climate change and just transition new standard and also the revision of the energy standard. GRI, as you might know, is a global standard setter. We are an independent standard setters. We're based on stakeholder engagement to develop our standards, and we focus on impacts reporting. So we, I guess, we'll discuss how we fit within the landscape, but yeah, for now, over to Alberto.
Okay, and then Alberto.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm Chief Technical Officer for the Science Based Targets Initiative. Tracy already did a very good overview of SBTI. Very happy to be here with the panel, excellent panel, also our online panelists, and with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. We also have dialing in, we have Pankaj Bhatia, who's the director of GHG Protocol. Pankaj, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Pankaj Bhatia. I'm Global Director of Greenhouse Gas Protocol at WRI.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us, dialing in. We are really delighted to have you. Okay, so everyone, before we dive into the questions that I have for the panelists, I'd like to just set the stage and explain a little bit about the international climate standards system, right? How does the system work, and what role do these different players play in the system? So I'm going to start with Emily and ask her to give us the lay of the land, and then my other panelists will jump in and add where their organizations fit. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Tracy. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I am part of the ISO system, or the international standard system that is comprised of government-recognized or government-appointed national standards bodies around the world. The purpose of this system is to help the world come to common agreements on shared solutions to shared problems. We are here today in Baku to talk about a really obvious example of a shared problem where we need shared solutions. And so the purpose of the ISO system is to help convene countries, each comprising of experts from their national stakeholders and national economy, to help facilitate international negotiations and agree on what an international standard to address a shared problem should look like. However, we do not exist in a vacuum, and this panel is proof of that. So I want to talk about and zoom out a little bit from the ISO system and talk about the story of how this process fits together and how this picture fits together. And the story I want to tell is with making reference to something that many of you may have heard of, known as the conveyor belt model for global net zero governance. This is taken from a theory of change published by Professor Thomas Hale at the University of Oxford, a global expert in global governance and climate governance. And the conveyor belt model is really relevant to today's proceedings because it helps tell that story of how each of the standard setters that are represented here fit together and help facilitate increasingly rigorous climate action. On the one hand side of the conveyor belt model, you have the existence of powerful NGOs, some of which are represented here today, such as the Science Based Targets Initiative, and orchestration campaigns. A great example would be the UN Race to Zero campaign, for example. And the conveyor belt model sets out that the purpose of these initiatives is to be the innovators, the pace setters, to help create norms, create ideas of what good climate action look like, and help build momentum in the market to achieve this. On the very other side of the conveyor belt model is policymakers and regulators, those instruments of governance that are much slower to act, harder to update, but when they apply, they are binding. And in the middle of the conveyor belt model, connecting these groups, is the international standard system. So to bring it back to your question, Tracy, which is very apt for framing of today's discussion, we need to think about how all these different organizations fit together, helping to pass the baton from one to the other to help the world move from a place of predominantly voluntary climate action alone, although I'm pleased to say and see that that is getting less prevalent now, and help facilitate a coherent policy and regulatory supported net zero economy. And that is how I think all of these different systems fit together.
So where does GRI fit in that picture?
Okay, I'll try. So GRI fits within the impact materiality perspective. So we are a global voluntary standard setter. So we fit within the voluntary standard setters organizations, but we cover the impacts of the reporting. So we have 40 topic standards across the different ESG spectrum, and we cover impacts. So what are the impacts the organization cause on people, the environment, the economy? So that's what the focus of GRI. And speaking of the climate change standard, the new standard that will be releasing in Q1 next year, of course we cover a broad set of topics, and I'm sure we'll discuss more during this panel, again, from an impact perspective. So what are the impacts that an organization cause in relation to climate-related topics like just transition, emissions reduction target, etc. And we do work with all of the organizations in the landscape. So we work with the protocol that are the methodology that our standards are based on. We work with the SBTI for the setting of targets, of course, and we'll work with ISO Net Zero team with the development of these new standards.
Pankaj, what about GHGP? Where
Yes,
does
thank-
GHGP fit?
Yes, exactly. I think maybe the way I would describe it is a building blocks theory. Just picking up the model Emily was outlining in terms of the conveyor belt theory. So perhaps we could consider GHGP as providing building blocks for different programs on two important questions, which is where the GHGP's contribution is. The first question is, what is important to report for companies from the perspective of ensuring full accountability of their impacts? And so that's where the value chain accounting comes. That's where scopes 1, 2, and 3 comes. So that is one question that GHGP addresses. The second question is, how do you quantify these categories in a consistent way, in an accurate and complete way, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3? And so these are the two important questions that GHGP addresses, and I believe these become then building blocks for other programs to layer in their rules. GHGP does not provide rules, for example, requirements or rules on how do you set targets. So if we just focus on what do you report and how do you report, but what targets to set, how do you set targets, we leave that to other programs. So that's how I will describe where GHGP sits in this ecosystem.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just going to call out 3 words that stuck out for me: consistent, accurate, and complete accounting. So GHGP is providing us with a framework to account for emissions. Alberto, where does SBTI come into all of this?
I think the way you described it at the beginning, Tracy, resonates with me, and also all of you. I see this in the building blocks that Pankaj mentioned. The first building block is measurement. That's where the greenhouse gas protocol comes into play. The second is management of emissions. And there's different ways in which emissions can be managed. And in SBTI, we approach this through target setting targets to reduce emissions. That's where we fit in. And then the third step is reporting, right? That's where I see GRI and other frameworks. And then we have different types of standards. We have standards, as Emily mentioned, that are voluntary standards. I would say that's probably the case for SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and GRI. Then we have international standards like ISO, but we also have emerging international standards related to reporting, for instance, ISSB. And we have regulatory frameworks, like, for instance, ESRS in Europe that is now providing a reporting or disclosure framework, but that's in the regulatory space. So I think these are the different roles and then the types of standards that we have. And of course, we are all a community of standards working together, trying to make life as easy as possible for all the companies that are in the process of decarbonizing.
So GHGP, ISO, GRI, ISSB, IFRS, it's a little bit confusing. So glad that you're all here sticking with us. Let's go into some of the detail and see if we can find out what's happening with these different initiatives. I'm going to start with GRI. So, Margarita, GRI has been a pioneer in corporate sustainability reporting since 1987. I was a child then,
Me
with
too.
over 10,000 companies reporting under GRI. Can you explain, please, the key drivers behind GRI's recent revisions to its climate standards?
Of course. So as I said, GRI focus on impacts reporting, and also I forgot to mention before that we are reporting standards. That means that we are not a methodology, and we also don't explain how to set emissions reduction targets, because for that you have SBTi and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for the methodology. So what we do is that we cover all of the relevant topics on a certain related topics, in this case climate, and we put it in a standard for organization to report on it. So for this new revision, so what we are doing is that we are revising, if you're familiar with GRI system, GRI 305 standard on emissions, and also GRI 302 standard on energy. So sticking with emissions and climate change, what we're doing is that we are revising a standard that only covers the scopes accounting, which is extremely important, but of course we know now the stakeholders are looking for a broader reporting on different topics. So now in this new revision, we are covering 6 new topics, including just transition, transition plans, but also adaptation, greenhouse gas, the credits, greenhouse gas removals, and also the emission reduction targets. So now this is one reason for the revision, so having a broader scope for the climate reporting from the impacts perspective. Another one is, of course, as mentioned, and there's also the objective of this panel, to ensure interoperability, to make it clear for companies and to avoid burden in reporting. So if we had some very small misalignment with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, now we are just fully aligning with this revision. This is giving us the opportunity to align on the scopes reporting if very minor things were missing. Same thing with the SBTi, for example. And and before we were just having a chat with the panelists, and we just said, I was just asked to say in plain English that we do work together, like literally. It's not just that we sit in panels, like we spend hours of working together behind the scene. I feel like I know all of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team by now. We sit together, we review topics, and we have no intention to make it harder for reporters, because, I mean, every one of us covers a slightly a small or not small fraction within the reporting system. So we just actually collaborate.
Excellent, excellent. That an important an important point from the start of the discussion, collaboration. Just building on that, how does GRI ensure that the new standards are both rigorous and adaptable, because this environment is changing so quickly?
Yes, you mentioned before that the collaboration is in the DNA, and I will say that's also in GRI DNA and is also in our standard process, because of course we have a due process, so we don't develop standards within GRI itself. Like when we do develop standard, we put together a committee of experts on the topic. In this case, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is there along with a lot of other organizations, and we can when we don't fit all of the experts, because as you can imagine, we will need like a technical committee of 50 plus organizations. So when we cannot put all of those organizations together, we have peer reviewers, broader network to collect inputs, and this is from the technical side of things. So we develop the content, hearing all of the thoughts from the different experts representing different constituencies, because our due process forces us to not just consult with one constituencies, but to make sure that business representatives, but also civil society and the experts are consulted, also financial institutions. But also once we develop drafts, then we publish them for public consultations. So that is a very important process within the GRI standard development process, because that makes the public, the reporters, whoever wants to have a look, the chance to read the drafts and comment for months, like for about 3 months on the drafts. And maybe I'll just spend one more second just to explain where we are in the process. So for example, last year, around last COP, we published the draft for the new climate and just transition standard. We received more than 100 comments. Well, the comments were like per 12, so a lot, but like 100 organizations commented on the drafts, and then we spent months in reviewing those feedback, and we took those feedback back to the technical committee of our experts to rediscuss also what we heard was unfeasible to report or what is very complicated, and we rediscussed it with the expert, and we are now at the very final stage of the content development, and we are hoping to present the final standard in March to GRI board and to publish this climate and just transition standard in April next year.
Excellent. Everyone's looking forward to that. I want to go on to Pankaj Bhatia from GHG Protocol, who's joining us virtually. Pankaj, the GHG Protocol is currently undergoing a major revision, particularly for Scope 2 and Scope 3. What are the most significant changes that companies can expect in these revised guidelines, and why have these particular areas been prioritized by GHGP?
Right, thank you. And I just also will preface my opening point here with I think the last point perhaps you were mentioning, is there still a confusion with so many standard setters? But I think Alberto and sorry, I'm forgetting the name. Margherita, sorry, Alberto and Margherita address this very well. I think there is a symmetry, and maybe if we need to do a better job to communicate that. Symmetry is in terms of three broad functions: measurement, disclosure, and target setting. I think Alberto expressed it very well, that measurement, the GHG protocol standards provide the basic building blocks of measurement. There are various different disclosure standards who use those building blocks and add their rules. For example, ISSB decided to make Scope 3 a requirement. Well, in the GHG protocol, it is not. And so that's the nature of relationship, that they can bring their additional rules, but the measurement building blocks are same, common. And similarly, measurement building blocks are common for the target setting function also. But I take your point. I think that symmetry is perhaps no visible, and we need to do a better job on that. Coming back to your question here, GHG protocol is in the process of updating its major corporate standards. The corporate standards, Scope 2, Scope 3, and also we have introduced a new area of work, actions and market instruments. We will be developing new standards for this branch of work as well. The GHG protocol technical working groups have been launched, 4 technical working groups. Their first meeting was held at the end of September, and they are now regularly meeting almost on a weekly basis to begin to develop proposed text changes and new text in these 4 areas. Some of the important topics that we have identified basically through the survey process and then some additional consultations. We received more than 1,400 responses through the survey process on changes needed in the GHG protocol standards, and about 250 proposals. Specific to Scope 2, there are some topics we will be addressing, including what are the objectives of the Scope 2 standard, and according to the objectives, what should be the changes in the required accounting methods. Then improvements in the location-based method, improvements in the market-based method, and thirdly also what could be the role of project accounting methodology relative to Scope 2 accounting. We don't have enough time, and so I won't get into the details, but we will introduce a category specific to project accounting, in addition to location-based and market-based accounting, I think, in terms of its relevance to quantify Scope 2 impacts. Then we may also address some guidance for regional variation in global energy markets. We will also look into interaction with policies and programs, including SBTi, interactions between Scope 2 and Scope 3 also. On Scope 3, we will be getting into the materiality thresholds because a lot of feedback has been how can we help companies decide what Scope 3 categories from the 15 are material that companies should focus on. So I think there will be more detailed guidance on that issue. Boundary setting for Scope 3, data quality and calculation methods, performance tracking, and likely some more guidance also on finance emissions, category 15. The third area, the actions and market instruments, is going to play a very important role. I think we are going to introduce a structure of a corporate GHG emissions report as a broader category of accounting and reporting that includes inventory impacts and also market instruments impacts. Then what is the role of quantified impacts within and outside the value chain in GHG emissions report, and how do you quantify these market instruments? So I think this gives you a snapshot of some of the topics that we plan to address. There's quite a lot going on, and of course, it's a process-driven development of methodologies and changes. Technical working groups will ultimately propose changes and updated text that we will then take to the Independent Standards Board, which is the new body set up in GHG protocol to make decisions on our revisions as well as new standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Pankaj. So what I heard was the updates are market-driven. You heard over a long period of time changes that companies using your framework were asking for, that there was a lot of collaboration. And just to dig in on this collaboration point, you mentioned 4 working groups, I think you said. Are any of the organizations on this panel in those working groups?
Yes, there are. I don't have the exact information on all the members. There were 1,500 applicants for the 4 working groups. About 120 were selected. I think on average 25 to 30 per working group. So yeah, I believe there are members from, at least I know SBTI, but I couldn't be
You guys as well?
very sure about others. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are represented on the working groups. Okay, thanks, Pankaj. I'm going to go on to Emily at BSI and ISO. So Emily, ISO is also working on a new standard, which is called the Net Zero Standard. You're one of the original convening team. When we got together before the session, you and Alberto remembered talking about doing this 2 COPs ago, 3 COPs ago?
2 COPs ago when it was
2
launched,
COPs ago, right? You're one of the original convening teams at COP27. Can you share a little bit about the process and the timeline that ISO is following?
Absolutely. And again, to put it back in context to the comments made earlier and that Pankaj, Margarita and Alberto have made, take us back to that conveyor belt model story about the role of the innovators, the pace setters, the sheer expertise that we've just heard from my co-panelists. It is the role of these bodies to drive innovation and rigor, create these ideas, and make sure that we develop these market expectations that companies should be acting on net zero and on climate action, and these are the ways in which they can visualize and understand and account for how they do so. The role that the formal international standard system plays in this theory of change is that scaling and that underpinning of consensus role. And so it's with that context in mind that the new ISO net zero standard you refer to is sort of coming into being. It is not a competitor or a contradictor or a fragmenting initiative. I feel the need to say that up front. But actually, I would say it's a sign of even greater impact and that scaling role is taking place. So to match the comments just made, it will not surprise you to know that all of the organizations on this panel, and since we're in their pavilion, including WWF, are involved in the process I've just described, but crucially, so are the countries that I mentioned earlier, those members of ISO, those government-appointed national standards bodies that connect and know their national economies very well, because that is what they are set up by their governments to do. And it's this international process that kicked off when we announced it back in June on stage with IFRS, CDP and others, where we said that the ISO Net Zero guidelines, which I'll give a brief overview on in a moment, is being converted into an international standard on net zero for organizations. And to that context point, this didn't just come out of nowhere. Back in 2022, the world, I feel, correct me if you disagree, was riding high from a successful or what felt like a momentous COP26. It felt like loads of major economies had come to Glasgow and they'd announced all these net zero commitments, some had signed them into law. It really felt like we were cooking. But of course, there was still a lot of confusion for the non-state actor level, the organizations who, when we think about what NDCs actually are critically responsible for making sure that those emissions actually come down so that countries can meet these NDCs that they pledge at COPs like today. And so that's where the great work of organizations like SBTI, campaigns like the Race to Zero and the fantastic work of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol come in to help make that clearer. But what we do need to do, and I'm sure we all agree on this, is we still need to scale. This needs to become normal. If you are at an event like today, you are in the bubble.
Yeah.
You are the kind of person that comes to COP and sits at events like this where we try to explain to you the architecture of standards, which if you told your childhood self that you'd be doing that, you might think, why would I want to do that? We need to make this clearer and easier and interesting and relevant for everyone, no matter whether you consider yourself to have a climate change job or not. And so the ISO system decided, with BSI leading the proposal, to come up with a process called an International Workshop Agreement. And it allowed us to throw the net open wide to the world and say, come and help us piece together all the different considerations of what net zero actually means into a single set of guidelines. But crucially, we didn't want to do this with only reference to other ISO standards. ISO is very proud of its portfolio of over 25,000 standards. We've been doing what we do for over 75 years now. I think BSI, we can brag, we were founded in 1901, so we came first. But the international standard system has been doing this for a long time. But as evidenced by today, there is fantastic, phenomenal, and highly impactful work that has been developed to help companies make sense of climate action outside of this system. And so what we wanted to make sure we could do is develop a process and a deliverable known as the ISO Net Zero Guidelines that help stitch together all of that work into one deliverable, again, in a consensus-based process, but making reference to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which it does, the Global Reporting Initiative, which it does, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which it does, and many others that have been named today. And that was launched at COP27, where Alberto and I were having chats about the future of climate governance and what this means and how, again, can the ISO system do its job in helping to scale the good work of many, both inside and outside that system, to make it easier and clearer for not just companies to know what to do, but to help policymakers understand more clearly what the market wants them to do. I mentioned already about the convening of countries, but again, a really key difference that's important to understand about ISO standards is they are developed by market-based consensus. So this is particularly powerful when it comes to the other side of the conveyor belt model, the policymakers and the regulators. Because ISO standards are developed in a way that complies with and underscores the principles of the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, which is a sort of jargony, boring way of saying that ISO standards help to facilitate economic cooperation that underpins the international trade system. It is something that WTO members sign up to say that they need to use recognized international standards first before choosing to deviate and use any other frameworks. And that's good for the world and good for national and global economies, because it's just a plain English way of saying we want to, wherever possible, use shared consensus-based tools to things. Otherwise, the world is going to get increasingly messy and complicated if all of our standards are written different ways and use slightly different processes and slightly different terminology. So that's, again, where ISO has impact. And that gives policymakers and regulators that sort of confidence to go, okay, so this is something that has been underpinned by consensus, not just by sort of businesses in my country, but actually in several. And so that makes it easier for us to look at these standards and use them to inform the policy making that we do. So it is with all of that context and those functions in mind that the ISO Net Zero Guidelines is being converted into an international standard on net zero, to bring it back to your original question, Tracy. Because the ISO Net Zero Guidelines help to bring that coherent picture of all the different considerations of net zero in one framework, referencing all the different initiatives, including those on this panel, and what role they play within a net zero journey for an organization. But the feedback we heard from business was, this is great, and it's helping me to make a clearer business case for net zero, but I can't get checked against it. How do I show that I'm doing what the guidelines are saying? How do I show that I'm doing the right thing? And that is why that process to convert the ISO Net Zero Guidelines into an international standard containing verifiable requirements is beginning. Because we want to make sure that it actually helps you to do what you need to do and helps piece together the entire net zero journey you need to consider, so you're not left trying to work out how all these different frameworks fit. It's not an accounting standard, it's not a reporting standard. it's trying to piece together that whole journey for you. And it's why we're incredibly grateful, said it in private, saying it in public, we're incredibly grateful that organizations like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol through the WRI liaison, SBTI, GRI, and many others have chosen to get involved in this process to help make sure that we actually deliver on the promise we're talking about today of updating the architecture of corporate climate standards.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to have to speed us up to make sure we get to questions. Over to Alberto. Alberto, the SBTI's corporate net zero standard revision is a big revision for us. Tell us about the vision and the main goals of that revision.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Yes, the corporate net zero standard for SBTI was launched 3 COPs ago in 2021. It was the first corporate net zero standard of its kind, and I think pretty much in line with what Emily said, with the idea of SBTI being at the forefront, trying to innovate, trying to provide a first framework that would help companies that were at the forefront also in corporate ambition in setting net zero targets. And now we are 3 years down this process. We have now 1,300 companies that are using the standard. And so after 3 years of having the standard around, we identified this the right time to make the first major revision of the standard. We are looking at different areas for improving the standard. The first one is, since then there has been a 6th assessment report by the IPCC, so there's a need for us to update the underlying science behind the standard, the pathways that inform how companies set targets. The second component related to climate science has to do with the methods that companies use to set targets. There has been a lot of evolution in target setting methods. We want to bring the best of climate science in terms of how to allocate emissions to individual entities. So that's the second component. Then the third component is there has been a lot of evolution in terms of best practice. We have different frameworks that have emerged, reports, but also actual practice by companies. For instance, I was in a panel earlier about the H-leg framework that informs also best practice around net zero, the ISO guidelines that also brought other components that are important in terms of best practice, other standards that have emerged, GRI and others. And so we're trying to bring best practice into the update of the standard. Then related to this, there's a very important topic and very important discussion that has to do with Scope 3. Scope 3 is a topic that I would say is still pretty new in corporate climate mitigation. 10 years ago when SBTI was launched, there was only a handful of companies that were measuring emissions and setting Scope 3 targets. Now we have 10 years of experience. We have learned in terms of the challenges that companies face, but also in terms of the potential solutions to address these challenges. And so we are putting particular focus on reviewing the Scope 3 components of the standard. And finally, the final goal that we have, also in line with the topic of this panel, recognizing the different frameworks that have emerged and that are undertaking or undergoing this revision process. We also want to improve interoperability of the standard to make this journey as simple and as coherent as possible for companies. Those are the main goals.
Thanks, Alberto. Back to Margarita. You mentioned earlier interoperability with other standards and frameworks, and that the importance of interoperability. How is GRI working to ease the transition for companies, especially those with limited resources, to adopt these updated standards?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, for sure interoperability is one item because of course we don't want to have companies to do extra reporting burdens for no reason. So it starts with the development of the content that goes through working with everyone in this room, but also other organizations. Of course, we also have MOUs with EFRAG, with IFRS, with GHG protocol, hopefully in the near future, but we already work together. So the idea is to work together from the content development. Then, as I mentioned, during the content development, we test the content so that we don't get it too hard for companies. So we test feasibility through the public commenting period, we collect feedback, etc. But now we're past the stage for this standard because we're going to publish it in April. So basically, every time the GRI publishes a standard, then we put together different tools to make it easy for companies. So that goes from translations. So we usually translate it up to 10 languages so that it gets easier for companies in different regions to report according to standards. We usually put together, and we'll definitely do it for this one, we'll do mapping and data points, documents to show in practice how the different frameworks and standards align and are interoperable with each other. We'll do training programs. We usually put together trainings for every standard that is published, so we'll do it for the climate and just transition one for sure. We are putting together also pilot programs, so we are now testing this. Actually, on Friday, we will have a workshop, a GRI workshop in the Green Zone. I'm going to leave some flyers after this panel because we are hoping to collect inputs from reporters on how an effective implementation programs will look like. So that's what we'll be discussing in the workshop on Friday. So are these items and tools that I'm listening in the right direction? So for example, for the pilot, usually the pilots are for the GRI community members. So GRI has a community of more than 5,000 members, where the idea is to test new standards once they are released. So in this case, we'll be testing, is it actually feasible to report with all of the new disclosures that we're putting together? So it will be a 60 pages standard, so it will be a lot of work. But of course, like the objective is to get inputs on that, but also for companies to learn from peers through the GRI community. So, and then of course we have sector programs. So we have sector standards. We publish 4 sector standards on coal mining, agriculture, oil and gas. We are developing now textile and financial sectors standards, but we will develop up to 40 sector standards. So of course the new standards coming and the one on develop will be including the new climate and just transition standard disclosures, but for the 4 standards that we already published, for example, oil and gas mining, agriculture, will be aligning those already published standards to the new just transition and climate standard. And the idea is that also sector standards will help organizations in specific industries because those standards works in a way that already make it easier for companies within a specific industry to select most material, the impact material topics. So those are some of the programs that we usually put together when there is a new standard coming at GRI. But as I said, for example, in this workshop on Friday, we're really hoping to hear from you. So I invite you to join because we're actually want to test if we're missing something, if there is something you wish to see in an effective implementation program after a standard is released.
Excellent. So everyone put that in your calendars. I've got 2 more questions for the panelists, but in the meantime, I want to make sure our in-person participants, or maybe even online participants, have access to ahaslide.com, AHA capital slide, SLIDE.com, with the code GC6B2. Do I have a slide that has the... Oy. Let me put this on the slide so you guys can... Yep. So you can think about your questions and submit them. And I'm going to, while you're doing that, go back to Pankaj. Pankaj, with the new GHG protocol revisions, do we still have Pankaj? Because he's not on the screen. We do, yeah, okay. How is the protocol addressing the technical needs for companies setting net zero targets? And are there any specific changes to support credible net zero accounting?
Right. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Good. So, so as I said earlier, I think the 4 areas that we are working on, there will be a lot of improvements that will facilitate the use of measurement methodologies in setting better targets. Again, we have to remember the distinction between GHG protocol and the target setting in the context of net zero progress. So GHG protocol will improve its measurement methodologies, particularly, for example, some questions on the role of Scope 2 market-based approach, and so there will be improvements in the application of market-based approach in scope 2, clarifications on how that is part of an inventory methodology, and at the same time introduction of actions and market instruments methodology that I think as a fourth pillar of GHG protocol could enable better decisions by programs in setting targets for companies. For example, I think there have been a discussion also in SPTI on the role of market instruments. There are a variety of market instruments under discussions in the marketplace. And there are also questions about the integrity of the market instrument. There are questions about how do you quantify them in a robust way that you can trust that information. And so some of these questions belong to the GHG protocol actions and market instrument pillar work, where we will identify the appropriate role of market instruments, and then within each of those types, what are the methods to quantify them, how those instruments could be used by target setting methods, but without specifying how to use them. It is going to be a decision done by SPTI and other target setting programs. GHG protocol is also finalizing the land sector and removal standard. We are expecting to release it next year. So there is an introduction of removal accounting, first time in the GHG protocol. And clearly, I think there will be some interest in using also removals in meeting targets. GHG protocol will explain the role of removals in terms of targets, but again, will not set any rules. GHG protocol may also provide guidance on how to structure land sector emissions in target setting programs. And so those are some of the elements that I can speak to that I think will definitely be a significant step forward from the measurement standpoint to enable faster progress towards net zero goals. Thank you.
Thanks, Pankaj. Last question for Alberto. Alberto, with the corporate net zero standards revision and the new scope 3 focus, how is SBTI enhancing accountability for companies to ensure they're achieving the necessary emissions reductions?
Thanks, Tracy. Well, net zero is an aspiration, right? It's a North Star for climate action. And that means, and that's already embedded in the different frameworks, that companies go through cycles to basically go from where they are today to the aspiration of reaching net zero. And so with this notion of cycles, that's how SBTI was designed at the beginning, with near-term targets that are basically targets that are actionable in the short term, that are aligned to the long-term ambition. We have now hundreds of companies that are reaching the end of their first target cycle, and so we're looking at how companies can then continue this decarbonization journey, how they should set next set of targets, and then how to assess progress against targets for the previous cycle, and how to enhance and incentivize continuous improvement throughout the net zero journey. So I think that's the main way in which we are looking at this. And then, of course, that also requires to think about different components that go related to target implementation.
Okay, thanks. Right, so I just got my 5-minute warning. I'm going to ask 2 questions, or maybe 3, and then wrap it up. So we've got a question from someone deep in the ecosystem. Will the ISO net zero standard render the SBTI redundant? Boom, I'm going to give that one to Alberto. You first.
Well, I don't think so. I think exactly as Emily said, I definitely see ISO playing this role of scale up and being able to provide the bridge between the voluntary standards and policy. So I see a lot of alignment already and complementarity in the role of different standards. So I don't see that as an issue. On the contrary, I think as a mission-oriented organization, we definitely want to see this and also want to see the same rigor going into regulation over time.
And just to build on those comments, I think Alberto said the exact right word when he said mission, which is that we are all working towards a shared mission here, and as set out in my comments earlier, there are different functions and roles that different types of organizations can play in this climate governance ecosystem. And there are things that the ISO system probably couldn't have done first. I've mentioned that ISO standards are a consensus-based process. It's a lot harder to reach consensus on something, particularly something rigorous like climate action, if there's no evidence that the market wants it. So there is fantastic complementarity to organizations like SBTI and others that are helping to build that market momentum around things like net zero targets and science-based climate action, because it makes the discussions in the international consensus process easier, because there are different insights, there are lessons learned that organizations like SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, GRI and others have done through their work that the international consensus process can benefit from. ISO is not a system owned by anyone. As I've mentioned in my earlier comments, I'm sat here from BSI, which is the UK member of ISO, but we have more than 170 counterparts around the world. So once the ISO net zero standard exists, it will remain homed in that international standard system, co-owned and shared and applied by everyone. And that's why we have a really positive story of climate governance evolution on our hands here, rather than any worry about conflict or redundancy.
Alberto.
Just reflect on what you said, Emily. However, if at some point there's no need for SBTI in the future because that's already fully embedded in other standard systems and in regulation, I think that's a positive outcome, right?
That would be the best. Can we hope for that? Yes. High ambition, corporate and financial institution, climate standards embedded in regulation, and everyone adopting them. Can we all get on board with that? I think we can. I've got a simple question for Pankaj, which is about the time frame for the land sector and removals guidance. Can you share anything about the time frame?
It's the the sum of the remaining decisions are going to the new governing body, Independent Standards Board. Those have been some of the most challenging decisions that we have not yet been able to complete. There was some call for evidence internally, and we think now we are aiming at Q2 of 2025 to release it.
Excellent. Okay, so I've been told to wrap it up, and I want to give you guys time to get a drink and ask your remaining questions directly to our panelists. There are some interesting ones. Scope 3 is, of course, of great interest and uncertainty. I just want to reflect on what we've heard and what I get up and live every day. That is that while the system seems complicated, everyone has a role to play, right? Each brings something to the table. All of the players on this panel and in the wider standard setting ecosystem rely on technical expertise, which exists outside of our individual organizations, and then extensive public engagement, which happens through consultations and then piloting to check for feasibility. So standards don't exist in a vacuum. That's what I heard. They exist out in the real world. They are applied by companies, and feasibility is a really important aspect of their uptake. The building blocks are essential, and all of these standards are being updated in recognition of gaps that the market has discovered by trying to use them over many years. Do any of you want to add any last comment on that wrap-up?
If I may, to tie up the comments I opened with about how the international standard system is your system. It's not owned. ISO is the term used to describe this system. It is not its own closed institution. I have a call to action for everyone here. I see you with your laptops, iPhones, iPads, and for those of you online, you're already on your laptop, presumably. So I'd like you to open a tab and go to iso.org, iso.org/members. And when you do that, you will see the list of all of those national standards bodies around the world of which BSI is part, that federation of government-appointed or government-recognized national standards bodies. If you would like to get involved, which you can, I can't stress that enough. In the development of things like the ISO Net Zero standard, or indeed other standards on issues that are important to you, there are thousands of committees on everything from biodiversity to built infrastructure to water pipes. Anything that you work on or anything your colleagues work on, we will have a committee on it, I assure you. And apply to join your national standards bodies,
And-
National Climate Change Standards Committee.
Thanks, Emily. Pankaj, a last word?
Yeah, I think what you said earlier, I think we should really push for regulations. That's the final solution. Voluntary programs, including GATP, has been going on for now 25 years. And I think the final solution is through regulation. I'm so glad ISSB has taken a step forward with scope 3 required. More than 100,000 to 150,000 companies are expected to now report based on those standards. We need to do that in target setting also.
Yes, very quickly. So I also have a short call to action, so short-term one. So as I said, we don't live in a vacuum. We do want feedback. So you can come to me now and just share your feedback. You can come to the workshop. You can reach out through our climate inbox that you will find on the website. But we are really hoping to put together an implementation program for this new ambition, climate and just transition standard that works for companies, because we don't write standards for ourselves.
Amazing. Alberto, last word. You have 10 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks everyone that joined us online and in person. We are planning to publish our competency standard for consultation early in 2025. So we also look forward to your input and your comments. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Can we have him back for a picture?
I'm here. If we
Yeah,
can
we're
do
going to
that.
have a picture with you.
Thank you.